hidden deep in the golden hills of San Simeon, California, where the Pacific Ocean crashes against ancient cliffs and fog rolls through coastal valleys like secrets kept too long, lies a mansion whose story reads less like architecture and more like mythology, a castle that shouldn't exist, a monument built not by kings or emperors, but by a man who understood that in America, power doesn't require a crown. It requires control, control of information, control of narrative, control of what people see, what they believe, and ultimately what they desire. This is Hearst Castle. And its story isn't just about stone and marble and gold. It's about the very nature of American ambition, the intoxication of unlimited wealth, and one man's obsession with creating something that would outlast mortality itself. The year is 1919. The world has just emerged from the most devastating war in human history. Empires have crumbled, kings have fallen. The old order is dying, and in its place, a new kind of aristocracy is rising, not of bloodlines and hereditary titles, but of wealth and influence. And at the center of this transformation stands a man named William Randolph Hearst. But here's what haunts me about this story, what keeps me thinking about it late at night. This wasn't just a man building a house. This is something else entirely, something darker and more fascinating. Hearst already owned most of California's coastline at this point, already controlled newspapers across the country, already had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. So why? In 1919, did he summon an architect named Julia Morgan to a desolate hilltop overlooking the Pacific and say, I would like to build a little something. A little something, those were his words, for what would become one of the most extravagant private residences ever constructed in America. Julia Morgan. Remember that name, because this is where the story gets interesting. In 1919, female architects were almost non-existent. Architecture was a gentleman's profession, exclusive, protected, and yet Hearst chose Julia Morgan, the first woman licensed as an architect in California, the first woman admitted to the École des Beaux Arts in Paris, a genius who understood something that male architects of her time often missed, that buildings aren't just structures. They're expressions of the souls of the people who commission them. And what kind of soul builds a castle on a California hilltop? The location itself whispers of intentions that go beyond mere comfort or display. San Simeon, 250,000 acres of California coastline that Hearst's father had accumulated, remote, isolated, visible for miles in every direction. You don't build there for convenience. You build there to be seen, to dominate the landscape, to create something that can't be ignored. But there's another layer to this mystery. Why 1919? Why not earlier, when Hearst was younger and perhaps more practically minded? Why not later, when construction technologies had advanced further? Because 1919 was the year Hearst turned 56. The year he began to feel the weight of his own mortality. The year he realized that all his newspapers, all his wealth, all his influence, none of it would last beyond his death unless he created something permanent, something physical, something that would force the world to remember William Randolph Hearst long after his name had faded from the front pages he once controlled. This wasn't a house. This was a monument to immortality, and like all such monuments, it would be built on secrets, obsessions, and a kind of madness that only unlimited wealth makes possible. The real purpose behind this grand structure, to create a world within the world, a place where Hearst could quite literally play God, where he could control who entered, who stayed, who was favored, and who was cast out, where the rules of normal society didn't apply, where movie stars and politicians and artists would come to pay homage, to seek favor, to bask in the reflected glory of America's most powerful publisher. But why here? Why this isolated spot hours from any major city, accessible only by winding mountain roads that tested the limits of early automobiles? Because isolation creates dependency, because distance from civilization means that once guests arrived, they were completely within Hearst's domain. They couldn't easily leave, couldn't escape his hospitality, his generosity, his subtle manipulations. The remoteness wasn't a flaw in the design. It was the entire point. Construction began in 1919, but here's what most people don't understand. It never really ended. Not in Hearst's lifetime, not for 28 years. This wasn't a project with blueprints that were followed to completion. This was an evolving obsession, changing and growing and transforming as Hearst's vision expanded beyond anything Julia Morgan had initially imagined. The original plan was modest by Hearst standards: 3 guest houses and a main building. Simple, achievable, but Hearst had a problem. Actually, he had several problems, but the one that defined this project was this: he couldn't stop, couldn't finish, because finishing meant the dream was over. Finishing meant facing the reality that even this magnificent creation was just another thing he owned rather than the transcendent experience he'd imagined. So he kept building and building and building. Julia Morgan would later say that working for Hearst was like trying to paint a portrait of someone who wouldn't stop moving. Every month brought new ideas, new wings to add, new rooms to create, new decorative elements to incorporate. She made over 500 trips from her office in San Francisco to San Simeon, 500 journeys up those winding roads to accommodate, adjust, reimagine, and execute the constantly evolving vision of her obsessive client. The materials alone tell a story of excess that borders on madness. Hearst didn't want California limestone. He wanted ancient stones from demolished European monasteries and castles. He didn't want reproductions of classical art. He wanted the originals, Spanish ceilings from the 1400s, dismantled and shipped across an ocean and reassembled on a California hilltop. Think about the audacity of that. Europe was still recovering from World War I. Ancient structures that had stood for centuries were being sold off piece by piece to wealthy Americans like Hearst. And he was buying them, not to preserve them in their original locations, but to incorporate them into his personal fantasy castle in California. The challenges Julia Morgan faced weren't just architectural. They were logistical nightmares. How do you transport million-pound blocks of marble up a mountain with 1920s technology? How do you create a water system for an estate that would eventually require its own reservoir? How do you build on a hilltop exposed to Pacific winds that could tear apart anything not anchored to bedrock? The estate eventually covered 127 acres of developed land, but the property itself, that stretched across more than 250,000 acres. An empire within America, a private kingdom where Hearst ruled absolutely. The location's significance goes beyond mere isolation. San Simeon sits at a point where the California coast transitions from the softer, more accessible beaches of Southern California to the rugged, dramatic cliffs of Big Sur. It's a threshold point, a liminal space between two worlds. And Hearst built his monument right at that boundary, as if claiming dominion over both the civilized and the wild. The construction timeline reveals something important about Hearst's psychology. Most wealthy men would build their dream homes in 5 years, maybe 10. But Hearst kept this project going for nearly 3 decades. Why? Because it gave him purpose. Because it was something that could never be taken from him, never be scooped by a rival newspaper, never be completed and thus made finite. Julia Morgan understood this. I think she understood that what Hearst really wanted wasn't a finished castle. What he wanted was the eternal promise of completion. The first occupants of Hearst Castle weren't a family in the traditional sense. They were an audience, because that's what Hearst had really built. Not a home, but a stage. And he was determined to be both the director and the star of an endless performance that would play out on that hilltop for decades. William Randolph Hearst moved into the unfinished castle in 1925, along with his mistress, Marion Davies. And here's where the story becomes both tragic and fascinating. Hearst was married. His wife, Millicent, refused to grant him a divorce and remained in New York. So this castle, this monument to power and prestige, was from its very beginning built on a foundation of scandal. Marion Davies was a blonde, vivacious actress, 4 years younger than Hearst. He'd discovered her in the Ziegfeld Follies and become obsessed. Spent millions promoting her film career. Built her a bungalow on the MGM lot that was larger than most people's homes. And now he'd built her a castle. But Davies wasn't just arm candy for an aging press baron. She was sharp, funny, generous, and according to everyone who knew her, the kindest person in Hollywood. While Hearst could be cold and manipulative, Davies was warm and authentic, The castle needed her humanity to balance Hearst's imperial ambitions. The early days of Hearst Castle were legendary. Weekend after weekend, a carefully curated collection of America's elite would make the journey to San Simeon. Cary Grant, Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, Winston Churchill, Calvin Coolidge, the most famous faces in the world, all traveling to this remote hilltop to pay homage to the man who controlled what Americans read in their newspapers. And Hearst controlled everything about these gatherings. There were rules, strict rules. Guests were expected to attend communal dinners in the refectory. You couldn't refuse without giving offense. You couldn't leave early without permission. You couldn't skip the evening movie screenings in Hearst private theater. And you absolutely could not drink more than one cocktail before dinner, despite prohibition supposedly being the law of the land. That last detail reveals something important. Hearst didn't care about prohibition. He had his own wine cellar stocked with thousands of bottles, but he controlled access to it, controlled who drank what and how much. Even pleasure at Hearst Castle was rationed and monitored. The mansion played a role far beyond that of a private residence. It was a seat of power. Political deals were made in those rooms. Film careers were launched or destroyed based on who Hearst favored. Newspaper policies that would shape public opinion were decided during those weekend gatherings. But there were darker undercurrents. Hearst was jealous, intensely jealous. If Marion Davies paid too much attention to another man, that man would find himself suddenly uninvited. If a female guest was too beautiful, too charismatic, threatened Marion's position as the castle's queen, she wouldn't be asked back. And there were the mysterious disappearances from guest lists. People who'd been regular visitors would suddenly never return, and no one would speak of them. What had they done to offend? What secrets had they learned? The castle's isolation meant that whatever happened on that hilltop stayed there, invisible to the outside world. One notable event still whispers through Hollywood history. In 1924, before the castle was even officially habitable, Hearst hosted a party on his yacht that included Charlie Chaplin, Marion Davies, and a producer named Thomas Ince. Ince left the yacht mysteriously ill and died days later. The official cause was heart failure, but rumors persisted for decades that Hearst had shot Ince, either intentionally or while aiming at Chaplin in a jealous rage over Marion. The truth, we'll never know. That's the power of wealth and isolation. The power to make inconvenient truths disappear. The power to control the narrative even when you're at the center of it. The castle also served functions beyond mere entertainment. Hearst would conduct business from San Simeon, making editorial decisions that affected his newspaper empire's coverage of national events. His editorial policy shaped American public opinion on everything from political candidates to foreign wars. And he did much of this from a remote California hilltop, like a king issuing decrees from his throne. To call Hearst Castle a house is like calling the ocean a puddle. By the time construction had progressed to something resembling completion, though again, it was never truly finished, the estate consisted of 165 rooms across multiple buildings. The main house, called Casa Grande, rose like a Spanish cathedral transported through time and space. 115 rooms in the main residence alone, 38 bedrooms, 41 bathrooms, and every single one designed with a level of detail and opulence that borders on the pathological. Julia Morgan drew on Mediterranean Revival architecture, but this wasn't pure style. This was architectural college. Spanish colonial towers rose beside Renaissance facades. Gothic windows looked out over Moorish, tiled courtyards. It shouldn't have worked. By every rule of architectural harmony, it should have been a disaster. But somehow, through Julia Morgan's genius and Hearst's relentless vision, it became something transcendent. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but powerful, overwhelming, unforgettable. The main building featured two towers that could be seen for miles. The taller one, on the south side, rose 137 feet. These weren't functional towers. They served no practical purpose. They were pure symbol, declarations of dominance over the landscape. When you approached San Simeon from the coast, those towers were the first thing you saw, announcing that you were entering Hearst's kingdom. The assembly room was the heart of Casa Grande. Imagine walking into a space that combines a 16th century Italian palazzo with a Spanish monastery. The ceiling, carved and painted wood from a Spanish convent, shipped across the Atlantic and reassembled piece by careful piece. The tapestries on the walls dated back to the 1400s. The fireplace was Renaissance Italian. The choir stalls lining the walls were from a demolished church in Spain. You weren't walking into a room. You were walking into captured history, into the physical manifestation of one man's ability to acquire and control pieces of European heritage and arrange them according to his personal aesthetic. The refectory, the dining room, tells you everything you need to know about how Hearst saw himself. The room is 100 feet long. The ceiling is carved walnut from an Italian monastery. Silk banners depicting saints hang from the walls like this is a medieval great hall. The table. It could seat 40 guests, and at the head of that table, in a throne-like chair that literally was a throne, acquired from an Italian castle, sat William Randolph Hearst. Every meal was theater. Hearst would preside like a Renaissance prince, with Marion Davies at his side, and America's most famous celebrities arranged according to their current standing in his favor. Seating at that table was political. Where you sat told everyone how Hearst viewed your importance. But here's what's fascinating. Despite all this opulence, despite the priceless art and the architectural grandeur, Hearst insisted on certain common touches. Ketchup bottles on the table, paper napkins instead of cloth, because Hearst had been raised with money, but his father had been a rough mining magnate who believed in unpretentious eating. So even in this castle filled with Renaissance masterpieces, there were ketchup bottles. The juxtaposition was almost surreal. The theater, because of course there was a private theater seated 50, not a large theater by Hollywood standards, but imagine a private screening room where the first showings of Hollywood films would take place, with the stars of those films sitting in the audience, watching themselves on screen while Hearst judged whether his newspapers would give them positive coverage. The library contained more than 5,000 books, many of them rare first editions. But here's the thing that historians have noted: many of the books showed no signs of ever being opened. They were decoration, props, because for all his intelligence and influence, Hearst was fundamentally a collector, not a scholar. He acquired beautiful things because he could, because possession meant power, not because he necessarily understood or appreciated their deeper significance. The indoor Roman pool is perhaps the most famous room in the entire estate. Picture this, a pool finished with over 1 million tiles of Venetian glass in brilliant blues and golds. The tiles create underwater mosaics inspired by ancient Roman baths. 8 carved marble statues of Roman gods and goddesses stand in alcoves around the pool. The ceiling is covered in these glowing tiles so that when you swim, you're surrounded by shimmering gold and blue light reflected off water, creating an almost hallucinogenic effect. This wasn't a pool for exercise. This was a pool as art installation, as religious experience, as yet another way for Hearst to demonstrate that he could create beauty and luxury beyond anything his guests had experienced anywhere else. The color scheme throughout the castle tended toward rich, warm tones, deep reds, golds, warm woods. This wasn't accidental. These colors create a sense of wealth, of comfort, but also of enclosure, of being inside something protective and exclusive. You were meant to feel embraced by the castle's luxury, but also aware that this luxury was controlled, granted could be withdrawn. The furniture was mostly antique European pieces, many of them museum quality. Spanish tables, Italian chairs, French tapestries. Hearst wasn't furnishing a house. He was curating a collection, and his guests were living inside that collection, surrounded by objects worth fortunes, casual opulence that after a while began to feel almost normal. That was part of the seduction, the normalization of extraordinary wealth. If the interior of Hearst Castle was about control and curation, the exterior was about domination of nature itself, because Hearst didn't just want to build on this hilltop. He wanted to transform it, to impose his vision on the landscape so completely that the natural and the artificial became impossible to distinguish. The developed grounds covered 127 acres but they were carved out of that vast 250,000-acre ranch that stretched to the horizon in every direction. From the castle, you could see miles of Hearst property, miles of land that he owned, that he controlled, that existed under his dominion. The Neptune pool is probably the most iconic feature of the entire estate. When people think of Hearst Castle, this is often what they picture: a spectacular outdoor swimming pool that looks like it belongs to a Roman emperor rather than a California newspaper magnate. The pool is 104 feet long. It holds 5,000 gallons of water. It's faced with Vermont marble, and it's surrounded by a colonnade of marble columns, marble pavilions with Italian cypress trees, and marble sculptures of Neptune and the Nereids that give the pool its name. But here's what makes the Neptune pool truly extraordinary. Hearst wasn't satisfied with it. He had it rebuilt 3 times. 3 times, Julia Morgan's crew had to drain the pool, tear out the existing structure, and rebuild it according to Hearst's new vision. The final version wasn't completed until 1936, 17 years after construction on the castle began. That obsessive rebuilding tells you everything about Hearst's psychology. He could never be satisfied, could never accept completion. There was always a better version in his mind, always a grander vision that the current reality failed to match. The gardens were designed by Isabella Warren, a landscape architect who understood the Hearst wanted not natural beauty but controlled fantasy. She planted thousands of plants and trees, many of them imported from around the world: Italian cypress trees, English oaks, rare orchids, exotic palms, plants that had no business growing together in the same climate, forced into coexistence through constant maintenance and irrigation. The irrigation system itself was an engineering marvel. Remember, this is a hilltop in coastal California, subject to drought, with no natural water sources adequate for the estate's needs. So Hearst had reservoirs built, pipelines installed, an entire water infrastructure created to support his vision of paradise. There were rose gardens containing more than 400 varieties, citrus groves, experimental gardens where rare species were cultivated. Every growing thing on that hilltop was there because Hearst wanted it there, not because it naturally belonged. But perhaps the most surreal aspect of the grounds was Hearst's private zoo. Yes, zoo. At its peak, the zoo housed the largest private collection of wild animals in the world: zebraffis, giraffes, lions, bears, elephants, exotic birds, over 300 species at one point. Guests at the castle would wake up and look out their windows to see zebras grazing on California hillsides, would encounter kangaroos on their way to breakfast, would hear lions roaring at night, an African symphony playing out in North America. The zoo wasn't just about showing off wealth, though it certainly did that. It was about Hearst's vision of himself as someone who could possess anything, control anything, transplant any piece of the world to his personal kingdom. If he wanted African wildlife in California, he simply bought it and brought it there. Reality bent to his will. When maintaining the zoo became too expensive, even for Hearst during the Depression, many of the animals were donated to municipal zoos. But some were simply released onto the ranch property. And here's an eerie legacy to this day: zebras still roam wild on the hills around San Simeon. Descendants of Hearst zoo animals living free in California, a permanent mark of his determination to reshape nature according to his desires. The tree plantings alone numbered in the thousands. Morgan and Warren planted specifically to create the impression of a Mediterranean estate that had stood for centuries, even though everything had been installed within Hearst's lifetime. Fast-growing trees were placed strategically to create shade and frame views. Cypress trees lined walkways like sentinels. Ancient olive trees, some over 1,000 years old, were purchased from estates in Europe and transplanted to California. The roots alone weighed tons. The logistics of moving them were staggering, but Hearst wanted instant antiquity. He wanted his castle to look as though it had stood for generations, and he was willing to spend whatever it took to create that illusion. The esplanade that connected the main house to the Neptune pool was lined with classical statuary, Greek gods, Roman heroes, marble figures that had witnessed centuries of European history now stood watch over a California hillside, eternal guardians of a kingdom that existed only in one man's imagination. And everywhere you looked, there was evidence of meticulous planning combined with almost reckless excess. Fountains imported from Italian villas, stone benches from French monasteries, entire courtyards reconstructed from photographs of Spanish palaces. This wasn't landscaping, this was historical appropriation on a massive scale. Here's something most people don't realize about Hearst Castle. It was never static, never finished. From 1919 until Hearst's financial crisis in the late 1930s, the castle was in a constant state of transformation. What existed one year might be demolished and rebuilt the next. Wings were added, removed, reconfigured. Rooms were redesigned according to Hearst's latest acquisitions or newest obsessions. Julia Morgan kept meticulous records of these changes, and they reveal a pattern that borders on compulsion. Hearst would see something in his travels, a ceiling in a Spanish monastery, a doorway in an Italian villa, a fountain in a French chateau, and he would want it. Not a reproduction, the actual thing. And then Julia Morgan would have to figure out how to incorporate this new acquisition into an existing structure, which often meant tearing out what had just been completed and starting over. The most dramatic renovation came to the Neptune pool, which I mentioned earlier. The first version, completed in 1924, was relatively modest by Hearst standards, but Hearst just wasn't satisfied. By 1927, he'd ordered it completely rebuilt. Larger, more ornate, more impressive. That version stood until 1934, when Hearst decided it still wasn't grand enough. A third complete reconstruction followed. Each rebuild cost hundreds of thousands of Depression-era dollars. While Americans were standing in bread lines, Hearst was draining and rebuilding a swimming pool because the marble wasn't quite the right shade of white. The Gothic study in Casa Grande underwent at least 5 complete redesigns. Each time, priceless antiques would be removed, walls would be reconfigured, new pieces would be installed. Morgan's letters to Hearst during this period reveal a patient architect dealing with an impossibly demanding client. She would gently suggest that perhaps the current configuration was satisfactory. Hearst would insist it wasn't, and Morgan would begin again. What prompted these endless renovations? Part of it was Hearst's collector mentality. He was constantly acquiring new pieces, art, furniture, architectural elements, and he needed somewhere to display them. The castle became a living museum that had to constantly evolve to accommodate new acquisitions. But there was something deeper, something psychological. As long as the castle was unfinished, Hearst had a project, a purpose, a reason to engage with life. Completion meant facing mortality, facing the reality that even this magnificent achievement was finite. So he kept building, kept changing, kept pursuing a vision of perfection that always remained just out of reach. The financial crash of 1937 finally forced an end to the constant construction. Hearst's newspaper empire, which had seemed invincible, was drowning in debt. He'd borrowed against everything, spent beyond even his enormous means. The banks stepped in and forced him to liquidate assets. Artwork was sold. Properties were put on the market. The castle itself was at risk. Marion Davies, the showgirl mistress who everyone had dismissed as a gold digger, proved her love was real. She wrote Hearst a check for $1 million. Her own money, earned from her film career to help him keep San Simeon. It wasn't enough to solve his problems, but it was enough to forestall immediate disaster. Construction at the castle stopped. The crew was dismissed. Julia Morgan's 500-trip marathon of architectural accommodation came to an end. And Hearst, for the first time in nearly 20 years, had to accept that his castle would remain forever unfinished. In some ways, this was fitting. The incompleteness became part of the castle's character. Rooms that were meant to be finished were left in various states of completion. Plans that existed only on paper would never be realized. The castle became a monument to both extraordinary achievement and the ultimate limits even unlimited ambition must face. When Hearst's health began to fail in the late 1940s, he and Marion were forced to leave San Simeon. His doctors insisted he needed to be closer to medical facilities. So in 1947, Hearst left his castle for the last time, moving to a house Marion owned in Beverly Hills. He would die there in 1951, never to return to the hilltop kingdom he'd spent 3 decades building. The castle's historical integrity was somewhat maintained during these later years, though not by design. Hearst simply ran out of money to keep transforming it. What existed in 1947 is largely what stands today. The unfinished rooms remain unfinished. The completed spaces preserve that peculiar mix of European antiquity and 1920s California excess that defined Hearst's aesthetic vision. Every castle has its ghosts. Every great house whispers of secrets. But Hearst Castle's shadows run deeper than most, because this was a place built on contradictions, a monument to family built by a man who abandoned his wife, a celebration of culture and art collected by someone more interested in possession than appreciation, a paradise constructed by a media baron who routinely destroyed reputations and lives through his newspapers. Let's start with the Thomas Ince affair, which I mentioned earlier but deserves deeper examination. November 1924, Hearst's yacht, the Oneida, hosted a party for Ince's birthday. The guest list was Hollywood royalty Charlie Chaplin, Marion, Davies, actress Sienna Owen, columnist Luella Parsons, and others. Ince boarded the yacht healthy. He left it dying. The official story, acute indigestion led to heart failure. Ince died 2 days later at his home. Quick cremation. No autopsy. Case closed. But rumors exploded across Hollywood. Witnesses reported hearing a gunshot. Whispers claimed Hearst had shot Ince, either intentionally or while aiming at Chaplin in a jealous rage over Marion. Some versions had Hearst catching Marion and Chaplin in a compromising position. Others suggested Ince was shot simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The evidence, circumstantial but compelling. Luella Parsons, the gossip columnist on the yacht, suddenly received a lifetime contract with Hearst's newspapers shortly after the incident. Why would Hearst reward a relatively unknown columnist so generously, unless she'd witnessed something that needed to be kept quiet? Chaplin abruptly left the country for months. Marion Davies became hysterical and uncontrollable, according to some accounts. Hearst newspapers never reported on the incident. Odd for a media empire that covered everything, unless they were actively suppressing the story. The truth. We'll never know. That's the power Hearst wielded. The power to make inconvenient truths disappear. To control the narrative so completely that even murder, if it was murder, could be buried under layers of official stories and strategic silence. But the Ince affair is just the most famous of Hearst Castle's dark tales. There are others quieter, more subtle, but no less disturbing. Guests reported strange experiences in certain rooms of the castle. Footsteps in empty hallways, doors that open and close without anyone touching them, cold spots in rooms that shouldn't be cold, shadows that moved against the light. The celestial suite, one of the most elaborate guest rooms, was reportedly avoided by some visitors. They claimed to feel watched, uncomfortable, as though the room held some presence that didn't welcome intruders. Staff members refused to work alone in certain parts of Casa Grande, particularly late at night. Were these actual hauntings, or were they the psychological weight of the castle itself, the accumulated energy of decades of secrets, jealousies, manipulations, and power plays, in a place where every guest was performing, where every smile might hide calculation, where careers and reputations hung on Hearst's whims? The atmosphere itself became heavy with tension. There were the mysterious disappearances from social circles. People who offended Hearst would find themselves not just uninvited to the castle, but blacklisted from Hollywood entirely. Careers would mysteriously stall. Films would fail to get distribution. Hearst newspapers would stop mentioning them, which in the 1930s was almost worse than bad press. It was erasure. How many lives were quietly destroyed by Hearst's displeasure? How many people found their careers, their reputations, their very identities torn apart because they'd made the mistake of crossing a man who controlled what millions of Americans read every morning? Marion Davies herself lived a kind of gilded imprisonment. Yes, she was wealthy. Yes, she had access to the most glamorous life imaginable. But she was never free, never able to be her own person. Hearst controlled her career, her social life, her very identity. She drank heavily, perhaps to cope with the pressure of being both adored and owned by one of the most powerful men in America. And here's a darker question that historians still debate. What happened to the artwork and antiquities that disappeared from the castle? Hearst acquired thousands of pieces. Shipping records document their arrival, but complete inventories of the castle after Hearst's death revealed that many pieces were missing. Where did they go? Some were sold during Hearst's financial crisis, certainly, but others simply gone. Were they stolen by staff over the years, hidden away in vaults that have never been found, destroyed in renovations? Or were they removed deliberately, perhaps because they were acquired through questionable means that couldn't bear scrutiny? There's also the question of what Hearst's newspapers did to shape American history. His campaign against marijuana, which led to nationwide prohibition and destroyed countless lives, was motivated partly by his timber holdings. Paper threatened his paper mills. His role in pushing America toward the Spanish-American War through sensationalist journalism literally cost lives. His attacks on political figures he disagreed with destroyed careers and families. The castle stands as a monument to the wealth created by these actions. Every marble column, every gold ceiling, every priceless tapestry was paid for at least in part by the human cost of Hearst's media empire. That's not supernatural haunting, that's historical weight. And it's heavier than any ghost story. There's one more secret worth mentioning. When Hearst died, Marion Davies was not invited to the funeral. Hearst's wife, Millicent, whom he'd abandoned but never divorced, controlled the arrangements. Marion, who devoted 30 years of her life to Hearst, who'd given him her youth and her career, who'd financially supported him when he was broke, was excluded from his final goodbye. That cruelty, that final rejection, might be the darkest secret of all. It reveals the truth beneath the gilded fantasy. For all its beauty, for all its grandeur, Hearst Castle was built on broken relationships, compromised integrity, and the fundamental loneliness of a man who could acquire everything except genuine human connection. When William Randolph Hearst died on August 14, 1951, the castle passed to his sons through the Hearst Corporation. But none of them wanted it. Not really. How could they? This wasn't a house you lived in. This was a monument to their father's ego, his obsessions, his particular genius, and madness. You don't inherit something like that. You're burdened with it. The costs of maintaining the estate were staggering. Dozens of staff members required to keep the grounds. Security to protect the priceless art. Climate control for rooms filled with centuries, old tapestries and paintings. The property was hemorrhaging money. And the Hearst sons, for all their wealth, couldn't justify the expense for a place none of them would use. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation made a decision that would transform the castle's legacy. They donated it to the state of California. The donation came with conditions and substantial endowments for maintenance, but essentially, the family gave up control of the property their father had spent 3 decades obsessing over. California accepted, recognizing that despite its complicated history, Hearst Castle was an irreplaceable historical and architectural treasure. In 1958, it opened to the public as a state historical monument. The private kingdom became a public attraction. This transformation is fascinating when you think about it. The castle that was built specifically to be exclusive to separate Hearst from the common masses he sold newspapers to was now open to anyone with the price of admission. The very people Hearst might have sneered at as beneath him could now walk through his private rooms, swim in his pools, judge his taste and his excess. There's a certain poetic justice in that. Democracy reclaiming aristocracy, the public literally walking through the private fantasies of wealth and power. But the transformation wasn't without controversy. Some preservationists argued that opening the castle to tourists would damage it. That thousands of feet walking through those rooms, thousands of hands touching those railings, would accelerate deterioration of irreplaceable artifacts. They weren't entirely wrong. The wear and tear of public access has required constant maintenance and occasional restrictions. Certain rooms are now off limits. Some furniture is behind ropes. The intimacy of the space has been lost to the necessity of preservation. The intimacy of the space has been lost to the necessity of preservation and public access. But the alternative, letting the castle decay in private hands, that couldn't or wouldn't maintain it would have been worse. Over the decades, ownership remained technically with the state of California, but management evolved. California state parks took responsibility for operations, preservation, and visitor experience. And here's where things get interesting. The Hearst Corporation maintained significant influence. They provided funding for restorations. They controlled some aspects of how Hearst's legacy was presented. They had approval rights over certain exhibitions and interpretations. So even in death, even with the property donated to the public, the Hearst family retained a kind of ghostly ownership. Not legal control, but cultural influence. The ability to shape how their father was remembered, which stories were emphasized, which were downplayed. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, different visions for the castle competed. Some wanted it preserved exactly as it was when Hearst died, a time capsule of 1947. Others argued it should be restored to its 1930s peak, when construction was most active and the social scene most vibrant. Still others suggested filling in the unfinished parts, completing Hearst's vision posthumously. In the end, preservation won over completion. The castle would be maintained as Hearst left it, forever unfinished, forever reflecting that moment when his money ran out and his dreams had to accept reality's limits. Famous figures continue to have connections to the property. In 1976, newspaper heiress Patty Hearst, William Randolph Hearst's granddaughter, was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army. The irony was bitter. The granddaughter of America's most powerful publisher, held hostage by revolutionaries who demanded food be distributed to the poor. The castle, that monument to excess, suddenly represented everything the kidnappers claimed to oppose. The kidnapping and Patty's subsequent participation in SLA crimes cast a strange shadow over the Hearst legacy. Here was a family that had built an empire on controlling narratives, and suddenly they couldn't control their own story. The castle, once a symbol of invincible power, now seemed to represent something more fragile. The vulnerability that comes with visibility, the targets that wealth and fame paint on your back. In the 1980s and 90s, major restoration projects began. The Neptune pool, which had been closed since the 1970s due to deterioration, underwent a multi-million-dollar restoration. The Roman pool required similar work. Those million Venetian glass tiles don't maintain themselves. Each restoration raised questions. How much do you intervene? Do you replace damaged elements with modern equivalents, or do you source period appropriate materials, even if they're exponentially more expensive? Do you stabilize what exists, or do you try to restore it to original condition? These aren't just technical questions. They're philosophical ones. They're about whether we're preserving a building or preserving a moment in time, whether we're honoring Hearst's vision or creating our own interpretation of what that vision should have been. The castle has also had to navigate its complicated relationship with the communities around it. San Simeon and the nearby towns economically depend on tourism to the castle. Tens of thousands of visitors annually bring millions of dollars to the region, but that dependence creates tension. The castle is both blessing and burden, bringing prosperity, but also traffic, strain on infrastructure, and the complicated task of serving as caretakers for someone else's excess. In recent years, the Hearst Castle Preservation Foundation has taken a more active role, raising private funds to supplement state budgets that are never quite adequate for a property of this scale and complexity. It's a hybrid model: public ownership, private support, collaborative management, that reflects modern realities about how we preserve complicated historical properties. Today, Hearst Castle exists in a strange liminal space between museum, monument, and cautionary tale. It's owned by the people of California, operated by California state parks, visited by roughly 1 million people annually who come to gawk, to appreciate, to judge, and to wonder at what unlimited wealth and unchecked ambition can create. The tours are carefully curated. Different routes focus on different aspects of the property. The Grand Rooms tour shows you the public spaces where Hearst entertained. The Upstairs Suites tour takes you into the private quarters where guests stayed. The Cottages and Kitchen tour reveals the infrastructure that supported the fantasy. Each tour is designed to last about an hour and reveals carefully selected slices of the castle's reality. What you don't see on the tours is telling. Many rooms remain closed to the public, either because they're too fragile, too dangerous, or simply because there's not enough staff to monitor every space. The unfinished areas, and there are many, are generally off limits. You see the completed fantasy, not the abandoned dreams. The castle is no longer the private playground it was designed to be. The Neptune pool is drained most of the year now, only filled for special events or photo shoots. You can't swim in it, can't touch the marble, can't recreate those legendary pool parties where Hollywood elite splashed in water surrounded by Roman gods. The Roman pool is even more restricted. Its delicate tile work and the sheer expense of maintaining the filtration system mean it's preserved as a visual experience only. You look but don't touch. You admire but don't use. The pools that were meant to embody physical pleasure now serve only aesthetic purposes. Modern amenities have been carefully integrated where necessary. Climate control systems protect the art. Security systems monitor the priceless collections. Fire suppression equipment stands ready in case of disaster, but all of this is hidden, invisible, designed not to intrude on the historical experience. The castle has adapted to contemporary needs through programming. Evening tours offer a glimpse of the property under lights, trying to recreate something of that magical nighttime experience guests would have had. Holiday tours during December attempt to imagine how Hearst might have celebrated Christmas, though the reality is that Hearst was often absent during holidays, preferring to be in Los Angeles or New York for business. Educational programs bring students to the castle to learn not just about architecture and art, but about media influence, wealth inequality, and the complicated legacy of early 20th century American capitalism. The castle becomes a teaching tool, a way to discuss larger questions about power, excess, and historical memory. But here's what's most interesting about the castle's modern existence. It's become more famous, more culturally significant than it was during Hearst's lifetime, through documentaries, films, books, and its iconic status in popular culture. More people know about Hearst Castle today than knew about it when Hearst was actually living there. The castle was the inspiration for Xanadu in Orson Welles' film Citizen Kane, perhaps the most famous fictional mansion in cinema. That film, which Hearst tried desperately to suppress, has done more to cement his legacy than any of his newspapers. The irony would probably infuriate him. He spent a lifetime controlling narratives, and the narrative that defines him was created by someone else, someone he tried and failed to silence. Current amenities are limited by design. There's a small cafe where visitors can buy refreshments, but this isn't a resort. You can't stay overnight unless you're part of a very select, expensive special program. You can't host events there, can't rent it for weddings or parties. The castle has been deliberately kept as a historical site rather than a venue, preserving its integrity even as that choice limits revenue opportunities. The visitor center, built well away from the castle itself, uses video presentations and exhibits to prepare tourists for what they're about to experience. It's smart design, giving context before the visceral impact of seeing the castle itself. By the time you board the bus that winds up the hill, you understand something of Hearst's history, Julia Morgan's achievement, and the complicated legacy you're about to witness. Staff members, dressed in period-appropriate clothing for some tours, bring a kind of living history to the experience. They're not playing characters exactly, but they're embodying a sense of what it might have been like when the castle was alive with guests and activity. It's theater in service of education, and when done well, it's remarkably effective. So what does Hearst Castle mean today? What can we learn from this monument to one man's vision and ego and desperate need to be remembered? The castle's impact on the surrounding community has been transformative. San Simeon and nearby Cambria exist largely because of the castle. The tourism it generates provides jobs, supports businesses, funds schools and infrastructure. In a region that might otherwise be economically struggling, the castle has created prosperity, ironically, by drawing thousands of ordinary people to witness extraordinary excess. But it's also created a kind of economic dependence that's uncomfortable when you think about it. These communities rely on celebrating a man whose values, media manipulation, unchecked consumption, the wielding of power without accountability, are increasingly questioned in our current era. How do you reconcile economic necessity with moral discomfort? The castle remains a symbol of power and prestige, but the meaning of that symbol has shifted. When Hearst built it, it represented the triumph of American capitalism, the idea that anyone with enough talent and drive could achieve unlimited success. Today, it represents something more ambiguous, the excesses of wealth inequality, the environmental cost of unchecked consumption, the emptiness that can exist inside even the most magnificent material achievement. Is it beautiful? Undeniably. Is it impressive? Absolutely. But is it admirable? That's a more complicated question. We can appreciate Julia Morgan's architectural genius while questioning Hearst's motivation. We can marvel at the craftsmanship while feeling uncomfortable about the labor exploitation and environmental impact involved in its creation. What we learn from Hearst Castle's history is multi-layered. We learn about the power of vision, that one person's determination really can reshape reality. We learn about the collaboration between architect and client that can produce something neither could have created alone. We learn about the way wealth can acquire and preserve cultural artifacts even as it tears them from their original contexts. But we also learn about the limits of material achievement. Hearst built this castle to achieve immortality, and in a sense, he succeeded. We still talk about him. We still visit his creation. But what we remember isn't necessarily what he wanted us to remember. We remember the excess, the obsession, the inability to ever be satisfied. We remember Marion Davies' love and Millicent Hearst's endurance and Julia Morgan's patience more than we remember Hearst himself as anything but a cautionary tale. The castle teaches us that you can acquire every beautiful thing in the world and still die lonely, separated from the person you loved. Your children indifferent to your greatest achievement, your legacy complicated by the means you use to acquire your power. It teaches us that incompleteness can be more meaningful than completion. The unfinished rooms of Hearst Castle, the spaces that exist in various states of construction, they're honest in a way the completed rooms aren't. They acknowledge limitation. They admit that not every dream can be realized, that not every vision can be fully executed, that mortality eventually claims even the most ambitious projects. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us about the difference between private and public heritage. Hearst built this castle as his personal fantasy kingdom, but it's become part of our shared cultural inheritance. It belongs to California, to America, to anyone who visits and learns from it. The wealth that created it was private, but the legacy it left is public. The future of Hearst Castle is uncertain in some ways. Climate change threatens the coastline it sits on. Earthquakes pose constant risk in California. Maintenance costs continue to exceed available funding. The state must constantly balance preservation with access, education with entertainment, honoring Hearst's vision with acknowledging his legacy's complexity. There are ongoing debates about how the castle should be interpreted for future generations. Should tours emphasize the beauty and achievement, or should they spend more time on the labor conditions of the workers who built it, the environmental impact, the media manipulation that funded it? There's no easy answer, and different stakeholders have different priorities. Some preservationists argue the castle should be frozen exactly as it is. No new construction, no completion of unfinished rooms, pure preservation of this moment in time. Others suggest that Julia Morgan's original plans, which still exist, should be used to complete the castle as it was intended, creating the full vision rather than the interrupted reality. Both approaches have merit. Both raise questions about whose vision we're honoring, Hearst's ever-evolving fantasy, or Morgan's architectural integrity, or our contemporary understanding of what this place means. What's certain is that Hearst Castle will continue to fascinate, to provoke, to inspire, and disturb in equal measure. It's too powerful, too strange, too magnificently excessive to be ignored or forgotten. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson, that what we build outlasts us, but it outlasts us in ways we can't control. Hearst wanted to be remembered as a great man, a visionary, a builder of empires. Instead, he's remembered as complicated, flawed, human despite, or perhaps because of his inhuman wealth. The castle stands as testament to both his achievement and his emptiness, to the beauty that unlimited resources can create and the hollowness that unlimited ambition can conceal, to the power of human vision and the limits of human satisfaction. On that hilltop in San Simeon, overlooking the Pacific, surrounded by imported gardens and antique art and marble pools, stands a monument to the very American belief that if you want something badly enough, if you're willing to pay enough, if you can dream big enough, you can have anything. But it also whispers a different truth, that having everything and having enough are not the same thing, that the castle you build to escape mortality might become the monument that reminds everyone of your mortality, that the paradise you create to control your world might become the museum where strangers judge how you lived. William Randolph Hearst built his castle to be unforgettable. He succeeded. But what we remember, what we take away as we leave that hilltop and return to our ordinary lives, isn't what he wanted us to remember. We remember that beauty and emptiness can coexist in the same spaces. We remember that wealth can acquire anything except meaning. We remember that the most magnificent cage is still a cage. And we remember, perhaps most of all, that the only immortality any of us truly achieve is in what we leave behind that others find worth preserving. Hearst Castle endures, not because Hearst demanded it, but because enough people across generations have decided it's worth the effort to maintain. That's a different kind of immortality than he imagined, but it might be the only kind that's real. As the sun sets over San Simeon, as the towers of Casa Grande cast long shadows across the terrace gardens, as the Neptune pool reflects the fading light like a mirror to the past, one question remains. What castles are we building today? What monuments to our own egos, our own desperate need to be remembered, are we constructing? And when we're gone, what will those monuments tell future generations about who we really were?